An old man once saw his disgraced son walking home from a great distance, and instead of waiting with dignity for the boy to approach and beg forgiveness the way custom demanded, he hiked up his own robes and ran. In his culture, in his position, at his age, a man of his standing simply did not run in public. It was beneath him. It exposed his legs in a way considered shameful. And he did it anyway, in front of an entire village that had every reason to be watching, because there was something. He needed to reach his son before anyone else could. Everyone knows this story as the parable of the prodigal son, a young man who demands his inheritance early, squanders it on reckless living, and crawls home in disgrace to a father who forgives him. It's one of the most beloved passages in the entire New Testament, retold in Sunday schools and sermons more often than almost any other parable Jesus ever told. But most retellings focus so completely on the son's mistakes and the son's return that they skip past two details buried inside the story that would have stopped every single person listening to Jesus in their tracks: a father's undignified sprint down a public road, and an older brother whose story the parable never actually finishes telling. Most versions of this parable stop at the party, satisfied that forgiveness has been granted and the story is complete. But two of the most culturally loaded moments in the entire passage happen either right before or right after that. Celebration and almost no retelling gives either one its proper weight. If you want the parts of Jesus' most famous parables that other channels skip past on their way to the tidy ending, this is exactly where Untold Bible Stories lives. Stay with me. The parable begins simply enough. A man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me." This is a request most modern readers pass over without a second thought, but in the culture Jesus was speaking to, it was almost unthinkable. Asking for your inheritance while your father is still alive and in good health was, functionally, telling him you wished he were already dead. His money mattered more to you than his continued life did. Under normal inheritance customs of the time, a father's estate was only divided after his death, and even then, the process typically unfolded gradually, with the father retaining use of the property during his lifetime, even if shares had technically been designated. What the younger son asked for skipped all of that entirely, demanding immediate, liquid access to wealth that should have remained tied up for years, possibly decades, until his father's natural passing. There was no gentle way to hear that request, and yet the father, without recorded argument or hesitation described in the text, divided his property between his 2 sons, giving the younger one exactly what he asked for, a decision that would have raised eyebrows throughout the entire community, a patriarch publicly absorbing an insult most fathers of that era would have refused outright, or at minimum argued against at length before ever agreeing to it. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. The text doesn't linger on the details of what that reckless living actually looked like, though later in the story his older brother will supply an accusation of his own. Prostitutes, wasted wealth, a life spent as far from his father's household and his father's values as geography and behavior could take him. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need, his timing turning what was already a foolish choice into a desperate one, arriving penniless in a land now gripped by scarcity with no family, no reputation, and no resources left to fall back on. He went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. For a Jewish audience listening to this story, this detail alone would have landed like a physical blow. Pigs were unclean animals under Jewish law, forbidden even to touch, let alone tend, and hiring oneself out to a Gentile in a foreign land to care for them represented about as complete a severing from one's own identity and heritage as the story could possibly depict. A son of Israel reduced to caring for pigs in a foreign land was about as low as the story could possibly place him, a complete inversion of everything his upbringing had likely taught him about what was acceptable, let alone dignified. and every listener in Jesus' original audience would have understood immediately just how far this young man had fallen. And he was so hungry, so utterly without resources, that he was longing to eat the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything, not even the coarse feed. Meant for animals he wasn't even supposed to be near, his hunger now so severe that even food considered unfit for a Jew to touch had become something he envied. It was in that field, surrounded by the exact animals his own religion considered unclean, starving badly enough to envy their food, that Scripture tells us he came to himself. This phrase is worth sitting with, because it implies something more than simple hunger driving a decision. It suggests the young man had, in some sense, been outside of himself the entire time he'd been squandering his father's money, caught up in something that wasn't truly who he was, and only now, at the absolute bottom, stripped of every friend his money had once bought him, did clarity return. How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Notice what he does not ask for. He does not rehearse a plea to be restored as a son, to be given back his place in the family, to have the relationship repaired as though nothing had happened. He plans to ask for employment. A hired servant's wage, a hired servant's distance, the lowest tier of dignity he can still occupy inside his father's household without presuming on a relationship he believes he has permanently forfeited. This was, by any reasonable measure of the culture, the most he could realistically hope for. A son who had shamed his father this publicly, who had effectively told him he wished him dead and then wasted the money that request produced, had no natural claim left to sonship. Coming home as a servant was already, in his own mind, an act of mercy he was hoping his father might extend. Most people telling this story now jump straight to the reunion, the celebration, the robe and the ring and the fattened calf. But before any of that happens, there's a detail almost no retelling gives its proper weight, something that would have been the single most shocking moment in the entire parable to everyone standing there listening to Jesus tell it. Everyone remembers the party at the end of this story. Almost no one stops to explain what it actually meant, in that culture, for an old man to run. This is exactly the kind of detail other channels blur past to get to the happy ending. And it's exactly where Untold Bible Stories exists to slow things down. Stay with me, because the run matters just as much as the return. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Picture what this actually required. In the ancient Near East, a man of the father's age and social standing, clearly a person of some wealth, given that he had property to divide, servants to command, a fattened calf reserved for special occasions, simply did not run in public. Running required hiking up the long outer robe that marked a man of dignity and status, exposing the legs beneath it in a manner considered undignified, even shameful for someone of his position. Elders walked, deliberately and slowly, their measured pace itself a visible symbol of authority and self-control. They waited to be approached. They received visitors with measured, unhurried composure that reinforced their authority and standing in the community, never the other way around. A father sprinting down a public road, robes gathered awkwardly in his hands, legs exposed for anyone in the village to see, would have been, by every social convention of the time, making an undeniable spectacle of himself, the kind of scene neighbors would have talked about for years afterward, regardless of how the story ended. And there is a deeper layer to why he chose to run at all, one that scholars of the culture have pointed to for centuries. A son who had shamed his family this publicly, squandering an early inheritance, living recklessly in a foreign land, returning penniless and disgraced, would not have been welcomed quietly back into a small, tightly knit village where reputation traveled fast and judgment traveled faster. There is a real possibility, rooted in how honor and shame operated in that society, that if the villagers had reached the returning son before his father did, he might have faced a formal public ritual of rejection, a ceremony some scholars call the kezaza, in which the community would symbolically break a pot in front of the disgraced person, declaring them cut off from the village entirely, a humiliation from which there would be no realistic path back to belonging. Whether or not that specific practice was already established in Jesus' time, the underlying reality is the same. A son returning in this kind of open disgrace risked public humiliation and rejection from everyone in that community before he ever reached his own front door, and every second the father delayed increased the odds that his son would face that judgment alone, from strangers, before ever hearing a single word of welcome from his own family. The father's run, then, was not simply an emotional outburst of love too big to contain, though it was certainly that too. It was a calculated act of protection, sprinting to intercept his son and absorb the community's judgment onto himself first, publicly humiliating his own dignity so that his son wouldn't have to stand alone and face it. Every person watching that old man run down the road, robes flying, would have understood immediately what he was doing, taking his son's shame onto his own body, in full view of the very community whose judgment he was racing to get ahead of. This is why the son's carefully rehearsed speech about being treated as a hired servant barely gets spoken. He begins it, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the text conspicuously does not record him finishing the line about becoming a servant. The father is already calling for a robe, a ring, sandals, and a feast before that sentence can be completed, restoring full sonship before his son can even finish negotiating for something lesser. The robe he called for was the best one in the house, not a hand-me-down or something merely presentable, a garment signaling honored guest status immediately, likely reserved for the head of household himself or for the most distinguished visitors the family ever received. The ring was almost certainly a signet ring, the kind used to seal documents and authorize transactions in the father's name, a direct restoration of authority and trust to a son who had just spent everything he'd already been given, effectively handing back the legal and financial standing he'd forfeited the moment he demanded his inheritance early. Sandals marked him as a free son of the household rather than a servant. Servants and slaves in that era typically went barefoot, while sons of the family wore shoes, making this detail a quiet but unmistakable rejection of the exact status the young man had planned to request for himself. And the fattened calf, an animal specifically kept and prepared for the rarest and most significant celebrations, meant that this wasn't a quiet, private reconciliation between two people. This was a public feast, a deliberate, visible announcement to the entire community that the son was being received back not as a probationary servant on trial, but as a fully restored son, immediately, without conditions, without a waiting period to prove himself worthy again. Here is where most tellings of this parable end, father and son reunited, the community presumably celebrating along with them, the story's emotional arc complete. But Jesus was not finished, and the second half of this parable is arguably the part that mattered most to the people he was actually speaking to that day. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house he heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what these things meant, and was told that his brother had come, and his father had killed the fattened calf because he had received him back safe and sound, and he was angry and refused to go in. The story never explains where the older son had been standing emotionally throughout this entire sequence, only that he'd been out in the field, doing exactly what he'd apparently always done, working the family land while his younger brother wasted his own inheritance in a distant country. When he learns what's happening, his father comes out and entreated him, in the same posture of humble pursuit he had used for the younger son, leaving his own celebration in front of his own guests to plead with the son sulking outside the door. This is worth noticing on its own. The father humiliates himself twice in this parable, once running for the son who left, and once again leaving his own party to beg the son who stayed. The older son's response reveals a resentment that had clearly been building for years, not something triggered only by this one celebration. "Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat, that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes. You killed the fattened calf for him. Notice what he does not say. He does not call the returning man my brother. He calls him this son of yours, a deliberate linguistic distancing, refusing even in his complaint to acknowledge the relationship the father is celebrating. Years of quiet, dutiful obedience had apparently produced not gratitude or security in the older son, but a mounting sense of unrewarded servitude, one that finally erupted the moment he watched someone else receive, in a single evening, more visible celebration than he'd been given in years of faithful labor. A father, sprinting through the street to intercept a disgraced son, already broke every social rule that culture had about dignity and status. What happens next, standing outside his own celebration while his older son refuses to come in, is the part almost no one remembers exists at all, and it's the reason this parable might not actually be finished the way you think it is. Subscribe to Untold Bible Stories, because the ending of this story is stranger and more unresolved than almost anyone realizes. The father's answer to his older son is worth reading slowly, because it reveals exactly as much compassion toward the son who stayed as toward the son who left, even though the older son had just publicly humiliated his father in front of the entire feast. Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. The father does not rebuke the older son for his anger, does not defend himself, does not point out the accusation about prostitutes might have been exaggerated or unfair. He simply restates two things. Everything the father has always belonged to the older son too, and this moment of celebration was never a subtraction from what the older son was owed. It was an entirely separate kind of joy over someone who had been as good as dead and had come back to life. And then, astonishingly, the parable simply ends. Jesus does not tell his listeners whether the older brother ever went inside. He does not resolve the tension, does not describe a reconciliation between the two brothers, does not confirm whether the older son's resentment softened or hardened further as the night wore on. The last words spoken in the entire parable belong to the father, still standing outside his own celebration, still pleading, with no recorded response from the son he's pleading with. The story simply stops there, on a note of open invitation rather than closure. This unresolved ending is not an accident or an oversight. Jesus was telling this parable according to Luke's Gospel, specifically because the Pharisees and scribes were grumbling that he welcomed sinners and ate with them, religious leaders who had spent their lives in careful, dutiful obedience, watching Jesus extend open acceptance to people they considered disgraceful, exactly the way the older son watched his father extend open acceptance to a brother who had squandered everything. The older son in this story was never really a minor character rounding out the parable's structure. He was the entire point, a mirror held up directly to the people Jesus was speaking to that day, and the parable leaves his choice unanswered because it was never really asking a question about a fictional older brother at all. It was asking a question about the men standing there listening, who had spent their whole lives being faithful and who now had to decide, standing just as much outside the party as the character in the story, whether they would go in. Two acts of self-humiliation hold this entire parable together, and neither one gets nearly the attention the celebration does. A father ran through a public street, robes hiked up in a manner beneath his dignity, to protect a disgraced son from a community's judgment before that judgment could ever land, choosing his own momentary humiliation over his son's certain one. And that same father walked back out of his own celebration, in front of his own guests, to plead with a resentful son who couldn't bring himself to celebrate someone else's return, absorbing a second round of public awkwardness for a son who hadn't even left home. Both times, the father chose to lower himself rather than let either son face what they were feeling alone. Shame in one case, resentment in the other, two entirely different wounds treated, with the exact same instinct to go out and meet them personally rather than wait for either son to come the rest of the way in on his own. The parable never tells us whether the older brother eventually walked through that door. Maybe that's because the real question was never really about him at all. If you want the parts of these stories other channels never slow down enough to tell, subscribe to Untold Bible Stories, a new story like this one every week. And next time, we're staying with a widow who gave everything she had, watched by a man everyone else in the room failed to notice was watching at all.